Good evening, everyone. You're very welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Sheep. I'm your host for tonight, Ciaran Lynch, and I'm delighted to be joined by Seamus Fagan from the Region Veterinary Laboratory in Athlone. Seamus, you're very welcome. Might just get you to turn on your camera and audio. And my colleague, Michael Gottstein. Michael, you're welcome back.
Yeah, thanks, Ciaran.
Thanks, Ciaran.
So we've a flock health focus tonight, and we're going to be looking a lot at planning ahead, maybe dealing with some issues that are core to some of the year on farm, as well as some basic management tips around how can we improve some of the outcomes as we lead into lambing. Seamus, we're going to start with yourself, so we are. We'll just get you to start sharing your screen because I know you've quite a lot to cover. And that's really looking at some of the health issues that you've seen in the lab over the years and covering around vaccination. Michael, we're going to join you in the latter half with some practical management tips around feeding and hygiene in the lead into it. Seamus, yours showing up grand. So look, it is informative. Seamus, I'll give the caveat, there is some graphic images coming up, so might be an ideal time to be eating dinner when we're watching this. Look, for anyone that's attending, if you have any questions, if you pop them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, I'll ask them on your behalf. We'll be able to take a few questions for Seamus when he's finished, and we'll do a wrap-up session at the tail end, Michael, with yourself and Seamus when you're both done. So don't be afraid to put your questions in the Q&A tab. Seamus, you're good to go, so we've you up on the screen. I'm going to hand it over to yourself, and look, we'll join you later on. And look, I think you have a couple of very useful messages in this one. So, Seamus, over to you.
Thanks, Ciaran, and thanks for inviting me to talk this evening. Just to start, I suppose I'll reiterate what Ciaran said. Quite happy to answer any questions or try and answer any questions anyone has. So, I always say to students or anyone, the only stupid question is the one you don't ask. So, please put in plenty of questions and we'll try and do our best to answer them. So just going to start on flock health. So one of the first things is wondering whether you have a problem or not. So that's where good record keeping is always very, very useful. Then you're trying to figure out if you have a problem, what's causing it. Plenty of advice out there from your Teagasc advisors, vets, other farmers, ourselves, to do some testing for certain things that will give you answers. Knowing what's the problem is always well on the way to fixing it. Things you should try and record. Look, I know it's not easy at times, especially heading into the lambing during lambing season and all that, but there are plenty of, and Teagasc have them up on different tips and tricks and different things of how to record, such as using a whiteboard in your lambing shed and just marking on it or having a notebook. But if you can at all, it's always very useful to try and some of the records that we have here put up there. Many sheep you're losing, how many lambs, roughly what age each of them are. Do you know what the major causes of death in each of these is? Try and categorize them a little bit if you can as you go along. Obviously submit some for post-mortem or if you need to try and get an answer. The other thing to me, is just key for good management of sheep is body condition scoring regularly, and probably in lambs trying to know your growth rate, so trying to weigh regularly is very helpful if you can. This information, will really help you to improve the profitability, sustainability and welfare of your flock. So just going to kick off with a bit on vaccines. So the common vaccines used in sheep, clostridial vaccines, the abortion vaccines, pneumonia vaccines, often these are combined with the clostridial. Blue tongue we'll do a little bit on later, but obviously the vaccine should now be available. I'm just not, it's been licensed. I don't know how much much about it. I don't know if anyone, but it certainly has been licensed. Then foot rot and R for the other two main sheep vaccines that would be used in Ireland. Should you vaccinate? Like anything, you have to pros and cons, but these are some of the things you're trying to, the cost and impact of disease, and that includes welfare. How likely is the disease to occur on your farm? The cost of the vaccine and the effectiveness of the vaccine are some of the things you're trying to figure out whether it's worth vaccinating or not. The first vaccine, or sorry, I'm going to then just, again, a vaccine is only as good as how well it's handled, if it's given properly, if ever, so things like clean needles, I think that's one of the things people not changing needles often enough is certainly something I've seen over the years causes plenty of problems. If you have a dirty, a blunt needle rather than a dirty needle, even a blunt needle, you're bringing in more dirt with trying to push it through the skin. It's harder to do. The chances of the vaccine working properly afterwards are a lot less. Storing them properly. Then there's always this question at the bottom, should you keep a vaccine? How long? How many can you get out of it? How long is it good? These are all not an easy question to answer, but it's something worth talking to people who are about vaccines that would discuss when you're buying them. How long you're going to keep them, or can you open it or keep it, etc. Because it does vary from vaccine to vaccine how sensitive they are to certain things, especially live vaccines are particularly sensitive to not lasting very well. Clostridial vaccines was the first one I put up there. In my mind, I had the 4 questions up there. I would recommend that everybody should be using clostridial vaccines. We just every year, it's amazing, year after year, the amount of sheep and cattle we see coming in and the cause of death is one of the clostridial diseases. Even today, wasn't a sheep, but it was a lovely 11-month-old heifer, and she was housed 2 or 3 months at this stage, but she died of black leg, which, people might find surprising for this time of year, but, pulpy kidney to me killed a huge amount of lambs every year. So I would have no problem in recommending that clostridial vaccines are well worth the money and the time to do them. You can see there's a long list of diseases there that they cause. The pneumonia vaccines, again, I would think in sheep probably worth doing, especially that most times you're including them with your clostridial vaccine, Heptivac P or whatever the P part of it. P is Pasteurella is the main one we're vaccinating for in sheep in Ireland, the main pneumonia one. Now, like a lot of things in science, the names of the organisms or the bacteria have changed over the years. And the two that are Mannheimia hemolytica and Bibberstenia trachelosi are the two that you're actually in your Pasteurella vaccine. But they are Pasteurella, even though they've changed the name. They're both just different types of Pasteurella bacteria. Mannheimia is more associated with direct pneumonia, where Bibberstenia is the one systemic pasteurellosis is probably the one we associate it with more. But again, I would think that in most situations, use of Pasteurella vaccines pays for itself. Because again, deaths from sheep from Pasteurella is very, very common, any kind of a stressor, and they carry the bug normally themselves anyway. So any kind of a stressor is possibly, and you'll have a few losses from Pasteurella. Just moving on, we're at the time of year where abortions and stillbirths, people are probably, if we take it that people are heading, most of sheep are probably March lambers, or that's in Ireland. So we're heading into the major time of the year for abortion season. The 2 main infectious ones again are toxo and EAE or enzootic or chlamydia. So again, if you're having clusters of abortions or, I would put these at the top. Clusters or abortion rate approaching 5%. I put them as you definitely should be making attempts at that stage. But it's also useful even, especially now while you're still quiet and that if you have a few abortions, it's worth getting them checked out in my eyes, because especially for this one, EAE, like the pattern we've often seen in flocks is someone has a few EAE abortions this year and they do nothing about it, in the sense they don't diagnose it and they don't do anything about it. And they think they've got away with it. but it's next year, or maybe even the following year, that suddenly things go badly wrong for them and the losses become huge. So I would say, especially if you have time now and you have a few losses, now is a good time to try and get a diagnosis on them. Even your local vet now, there's the diagnostics have got better, so they can swab them and send them to some of the labs to get a result. But obviously, if you can at all, submitting a full fetus and placenta to ourselves is probably going to give you the best chance of getting a result. That's just a typical EAE placenta, so you have all the pus and just really thickened in between. So you can see it's a bit clearer up here, a bit more normal looking, but you can see how thickened and angry looking I always say these EAE ones are. And then toxo tends to be these lads, the cotyledons and little spots on them are the main signs. But again, they're not always. These are what you call the classic textbook pictures. Unfortunately, we all know a lot of these diseases don't often read the textbook, so they're not as easy to diagnose often as that. I suppose just highlighting, so there is vaccination available for toxo and EAE. And if you look at the figures here that, now this is maybe close to 10 years ago now, but 63% of flocks were showing that EAE had, but very few people vaccinating. And again, I would think, talk to your advisors or your vets and that, but when the vaccines, both of them, give pretty good coverage nearly for the lifetime of the sheep if it's done properly early on. So I think when you spread that over the life of your sheep, they're probably, again, worth doing. This is just a typical twisted lamb, very topical this year in the sense that blue tongue can potentially cause this. That lamb, I think, was actually Schmallenberg. Border disease can cause problems like that as well. I suppose the message is that if you have some of these, please try and submit them or notify your vet or get blood sampling done, because we need to try and identify what it is especially if it's blue tongue. The earlier we get warning of it, and that the better for the whole industry as a whole, that we can try and manage it. This is just the brain from the one on the left. There is a Schmallenberg lamb, and then the one on the right is from both of them were near full-term fetuses. So what I'm just trying to highlight there is just again the damage that some of these viral things like blue tongue, Schmallenberg, border disease can do. That's the damaged brain and that's the normal brain. So the huge difference in size of them. I always throw up these slides. I think it's very important for people to think about all three, three legs of the stool: the environment, the host, and the microbiome or the pathogens. And usually to improve your results, it's doing a small bit of work in each area makes a huge difference. So sometimes people get wrapped up too much in this one. Vaccines being an example of people over emphasizing this one, maybe, where, vaccines are a great tool to have in the toolbox, but they can't be a crutch for bad management, poor environment, or, we'll say host factors like poor nutrition, etc. So it's always useful to, if you have something, or even before you have problems, that you're walking around the farm or whatever, just try and keep in mind, a little bit in each of them is often gives you your best bang for your buck as regards improving your results, rather than overcompensating on any one. Or, the three-legged stool is what people talk about, and if you need the three legs the same length to have a balanced stool. working too much on one and you have an unbalance. And then this is yourselves, everything revolves around what you do, what the management and that, so you're the key to all this in that sense that your decisions, your planning now will make a big difference to what happens and how successful your lambing period is, etc. So some of this is might be covered by Michael, and it's maybe some of you will be saying they're fed up hearing it, but I suppose it's the basics, and the key is always getting the basics right, and anything else is a bonus on top of it. But if you get the basics right, you'll go a long way to having a profitable and rewarding year. So one of the things, scanning, I think, is a key tool. If so knowing how many lambs she's carrying, knowing how far out she is from lambing, body condition scoring I've already mentioned, and then Michael mentioned, but knowing the quality of your feed so you can adapt what around that. They're key things that everybody should make an effort to work on. This is just, more, it's straight from Teagasc, a typical meal feeding. And again, this is where you need to know singles, twins, triplets. And again, to me, the body condition scoring is important. This is for a body condition score of 3. So if you have a twin and she's a body condition score of less than 3, we'll say 2.5. Maybe she needs to be moved into the triplet category. Similarly, a thin single, or maybe a young ewe who's she's only carrying a single, but she's thin. Maybe should be moved into the twin category. So to me, you need to house according to not just how many lambs they're carrying, but the body condition score as well, and move them around accordingly. Again, just this to some degree goes back to what the environment part of that triangle, or whatever you want to call it, is just having enough trough space. Again, Teagasc research work on this, and much you need for both concentrates and silage. Feeding a good high quality protein is very important, especially in the last few weeks. Gives you good quality colostrum, etc., which is vital give the lamb a good start. Probably 18-19%, but if you've a high litter size or ewes maybe a little bit less body condition score than you want, maybe think of upping it a little bit, 20-21%. Pre-lambing mineral, I'm a big believer that, I'd say this for both cattle and sheep, that for the last a minimum of 6 weeks, preferably 8 weeks. I think it's hard to beat, especially if you've housed sheep or cattle, is buying good bag mineral, measuring out, if there's 20 ewes in the pen and it's 20 grams, that's 20 is 400 grams, measuring out, weighing 400 grams and knowing the measure then that, a scoop is, or whatever size of container, and just going along scattering that on your silage every day, I think is, to me, gives by far the best results over the years. And to me, I think it really helps sort out a lot of problems over the year as regards minerals, and if that's done. So Michael is going to talk a bit about, but just sometimes not enough trough space for water as well. Maybe it's only in a corner of the shed, and especially if you have different age ewes and things like that, that some of the older ewes are lying nearer and younger ewes. But it's just something to keep an eye on. Like, it's one of the cheapest things on your farm, but it's one of the, it's really important, especially for the last 4 or 5 weeks when you start feeding a good bit of meal to sheep. Access to fresh water is really, really important for them. This scenario planning is just to give a bit of thought, things that can possibly change or go wrong, or you can't plan for everything. But, I suppose Mike Tyson, his statement was, everyone has a plan until they get hit in the face. So we all know Irish weather is very, very changeable. A storm comes in, or we get a wet few weeks when we really don't want them, etc. Eisenhower's statement was that um, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. It's the same sort of idea that it's worked over the next 3 or 4 weeks as you're going around. Just hopefully you won't need them, but think of, God, if this happened or that happened. And a lot of times you won't have the answer, but if you spend a bit of time thinking about these things, when something goes wrong, you're much likely to be proactive and get it sorted than suddenly going, oh God, what's wrong? And how am I going to deal with this? If you've given it some bit of planning, it's even if that plan isn't what needed at that time, you are much more likely to be proactive and start sorting the thing out quicker and earlier, which is always hugely beneficial. Again, basic things, clean, good body condition, navel treatment, colostrum. This is one I probably keeping everything as dry as possible. I think moisture plays a big role in allowing bugs to grow and get out of control in sheds. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a depending on in Ireland, if we have very damp weather, keeping moisture levels down in sheds can be an issue that we haven't as much control over as we'd like. But it's certainly something to think about how you keep, especially the bedding. Make sure that the drains underneath are well cleaned out. Just anything you can think of in the next couple of weeks that will help to keep things as dry as possible. And that may mean, just buying in a bit of extra straw or whatever that hopefully you might need it, but if we get the real wrong damp conditions and you just need to think of maybe throwing in a bit more straw. It's same with the number of ewes lambing in a pen. Like when you get a lot of ewes lambing together and just the moisture from the water bag, etc., the conditions underneath can get quite damp quite quick. So anything you can do just to try and keep everything as dry as possible, to me, always pays off in the long run. Just going to mention the iceberg diseases. These are, the ones that can be in a flock, but we don't really know they're there, or by the time we know they're there, a lot of damage may already be done. The top four are really, we're looking at them in adult sheep pretty much. So tonight I'm just going to concentrate a little more on border disease, which we see around lambing time. So it's very similar to BVD. It's very closely related, and how it works in sheep is very similar to how BVD works in cattle. So some of the things you're looking for, is poor scanning, lamb's been born weak, failed to thrive, and identifying this early and getting rid of these PI sheep, the same as the PIs in cattle, is really, really going to save you a lot in the long run, that your flock. So this is what we call the typical hairy shaker. Now, if I had a video running, you can see that the wool is always quite stringy. It's like hair more than wool. And the second thing is they often have a tremble. So that's the name, the hairy shaker. So it's just something to be aware of. There's not much of it about, thankfully, but the last few years there has been one or a few big outbreaks I'm aware of. So it's just something to have on your radar. Again, teeth, and especially back teeth, is something that I think should just to be on people's radar. If you have some few ewes that are thinner than they should be, just to think of examining the back teeth. Not easy to examine in a live sheep. You're probably just examining from the outside, looking at a difference in the jaws, So if you run your hand underneath the jaws on the outside, that's normal. That one is way bigger. And if you've done a number of them, you just get used to it. The same, you can run your hands along the top of their jaws, and if you see a big difference, again, and that's just there's big tooth abscesses in there, and you're just going to have to manage her as best you can if you have her at this stage and she's pregnant. If she's not pregnant, I'd basically be saying cull her as soon as possible. And if you do notice it, she's probably one for the tag in the ear, whatever way you mark for culling, once she gets, if hopefully she survives this lamb and gets her lambs reared. So if that was the 10-yo scheme, these were just, worms, parasites in sheep are always, and teeth were the biggest findings. These are the adult iceberg diseases. There's enough of them around that we need to keep our eye out for them. Excellent flock health requires attention to detail. So that's things like, regularly going through your sheep, and trying to identify ones that are getting a bit thin or something. Maybe you're moving them from the single into the twins, or you're just giving them a bit of attention. You're maybe giving them a bit more room in a pen together, whatever needs to be done. But, putting your hand on sheep regularly and trying to do your body condition scoring and manage them accordingly makes a huge difference in the long run. So now just something that's very topical, I suppose, but I'm not going to spend long on it. Just blue tongue. It's a viral disease. Unfortunately, it's incurred in the north. We still hopeful that may, that it occurred at a time of the year that was late enough this year that the midges haven't become, it hasn't become endemic in the north, but we don't know that yet, and we won't know till probably next year during the summer. And I suppose we're just hoping that, I suppose at one level Irish agriculture has benefited from it for the last few years because, good sheep prices because of the effect it's had on sheep in places like the Netherlands and other places. And so the longer we can all work together to keep it out or minimize if it does come in, the better for everybody. The clinical signs are fairly, a lot of different signs. So it's just if you have something unusual going on that you're not that certain, that looks a bit different, to get help, talk to your vet, notify, advisors, etc. The reason the symptoms are so variable is that the virus attacks the blood vessels and causes the blood vessels to leak. And essentially, so it very much depends where the blood vessels are, what signs you see. So that's why it's very hard to nail down what signs you may or may not see. We're just saying keep blue tongue out of Ireland. Blue tongue vaccine is something people will probably have to consider. Again, you have to go back to these and try and work it out yourselves. So just thank farmers who submit for post-mortem, the Teagasc advisors, and all the laboratory staff here as well. Thanks very much, everyone.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Seamus. You covered a huge range of stuff there. And look, I'll give you a chance here to catch a breath. Look, I'd just like to remind our attendees again, if you have any questions for Seamus or Michael, you can pop them into the Q&A tab. Seamus, might just get you to stop sharing there for a moment, and Michael, I might get you to just get ready. Seamus, look, a couple of questions in around Clostridium, and look, we might come back on some of them later, but I suppose the first one in that, and I'd agree with you, it's a kind of a no-brainer to vaccinate for it. Every flock out there is susceptible, and hopefully you don't see a car crash event with it. But the need, Seamus, to follow the full program, like not just give one shot and expect to get cover from it, and to follow it correctly. So the 2 shots is absolutely necessary to get that level of immunity.
Yeah, the first shot gives very, very poor response. Like what I mean by that, it probably covers. You'd have a good it probably lasts about 4 weeks. and 2 shots lasts a year. So given 1 shot is very, very poor value for money if you look at it that way.
You're not,
You're only getting 4 weeks cover, where instead of, 2 shots are getting, if you give the 2 shots, you're getting 6 months cover per shot, I suppose, or whatever. But given the proper, essential, Ciaran.
You're not getting an antibody response on the first shot either. Like, it's the second one that's really pushing that on, James, isn't it?
Yeah, that's what I mean. The first one, by about 4 weeks, the antibody response has gone below the level necessary to cover you for disease. So if you don't give that second, whereas if you give the second shot, you get very good cover. But you really do need the 2 shots.
That's really the penny wise, pound foolish one. Look, there's a couple more on that. I'm going to come back to you on them after, because I'm sure more will come in. And again, I just remind attendees, pop your questions in the Q&A tab and we'll take them afterwards. Michael, I'm going to throw it over to yourself at this point. Myself and James might just come off the cameras and that. You're going to kind of
can you see everything there and hear everything? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's coming up grand. You're going to kind of come over some of the practical aspects of management now over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah. So
I'll
look at
I'll throw it over to you there.
Perfect. Thanks, Ciaran. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, so look at, I'm just going to cover maybe a little bit around the kind of the hygiene management side of things. Like, just look at, really, I've 2 kind of areas I want to talk about. A little bit on scanning and body condition score. The 2 of them go hand in hand, and a little bit on hygiene and housing management. And look at, this is not new stuff. We've told people this lots of times before. You've heard this lots of times before, but I suppose it's kind of a little bit of a reminder maybe as to kind of where we're at the time, at this particular point in time, and what are the kind of things that people should be looking out for. So the first thing, I suppose, is a lot of people are scanning at the moment. Mid-season flocks certainly are scanning, so the March lambing flocks are well underway at this stage, and that's a good time as well maybe to have a look at the body condition. So I think by and large, so at the moment we're doing this on a lot of the farms in the Better Farm program, and yours are handling quite well. I think that's a function of, number one, people focusing in on that and having had yours in good body condition at mating time. Also, we had a pretty good back end, and I suppose the important thing now is not to lose that, not to kind of lose the benefits, if that's what's happening on your farm. So really what we're trying is to aim to reduce the body condition score loss between scanning and lambing. And traditionally, I suppose there was a conversation there had that in mid-pregnancy, it was a good idea maybe to lose a little bit of weight. And that's fine, I suppose, if your ewes have lots of weight on them and they have the weight to lose. But where that becomes a big problem is where you have thin ewes, and every flock will have a proportion of thin ewes, and in some flocks we have seen quite significant numbers of thin ewes. So a thin ewe for us is really a ewe that's under body condition score 3. And they're the ewes generally that give trouble, later on. And what do I mean by trouble? So there's a lot of work done on this, and ewes that lose a lot of body condition in late pregnancy or are thin lambing down, that's below body condition score 3, are less likely to rear their lambs. Okay, so that means that in the situation, thin ewes spend less time mothering their lambs, they have less milk, they have poor quality colostrum, and the likelihood of those lambs being lost after turnout is much higher than ewes that are in good body condition. So that should be our aim, to reduce the body condition score loss between scanning and lambing. And how do we do that? So the first one is nutrition. It's all about nutrition, I suppose. Feeding them to their body condition. So what I'm saying there is thinner ewes need to be fed more. Litter size. So, ewes carrying twins and triplets obviously need more than ewes that are singles, carrying singles. But then again, thin single-bearing ewes need to be fed with the twin-bearing ewes, and thin twin-bearing ewes need to be fed with the triplet-bearing ewes. And obviously feeding as well to a lambing date. And I suppose that's one of the things I want people to focus on at this stage. For kind of early March lambing flocks, we're 7 weeks out from lambing, for those flocks. So, triplets should be being fed for a while in those flocks, and twins certainly should be being fed now at this stage, unless we have really, really excellent quality silage. And very often, I suppose, the challenge is that we start too late. We start feeding too late. So starting in time is really important. The other thing, I suppose, with the nutrition in late pregnancy is to maximize forage intake. So forage is your cheapest feed. Hopefully it's good quality, that you took steps to make nice, leafy, highly digestible forage. But also, then what are the factors that affect the intake of that? you know, and I'll talk a little bit more about that because I think that's a really important one where a lot of people are falling down. Eliminating the health issues, and Seamus covered that quite well. I won't go into that in any detail, but look at the one that we would see a lot in house sheep is lameness. Okay, so getting on top of the lameness issues, and then good housing management. So just, you know, the way we house the sheep and manage the sheep in the house, really important. The other one there is the percentage of empties at scanning time. So when you're scanning now, and the scanner men are very busy going around the country, when you're finished, like, there'll be a percentage of the flock that are empty. And I suppose really we should be targeting, you know, that to be kind of less than 4%. And if it's more than 4%, then I suppose we should be asking ourselves questions. And that's a good try. You know, if that's a high figure, you know, is it because the ewes are thin? Is it because you have some underlying health issues? Some of the things that Seamus was talking about, you know, toxo or things like that. You know, was there infertility there in the rams? All of those kind of questions. But it's a good time to reflect. Say, look, I have a good few empty ewes. You've carried those ewes now since last summer with the hope of getting lambs out of them in the coming, you know, 7 or 8 weeks' time. That's not going to happen, obviously, because they're not in lamb, and that represents a loss for the system, a cost to the system. And I suppose the question is, you know, how can we prevent that? You know, so information is good, you know, and having that information is quite useful. But I mean, critical is that we use that information then to make decisions that improve the situation for us in future years. So look at the one that I talked a little bit about was maximizing intake. And, you know, generally we find that as we start increasing the amount of meal that we're giving the ewes, the amount of silage that they can eat starts reducing. And really important, I suppose, is that every bite of forage that they eat is high quality. Okay, so look at, it's a bit late now to change your silage quality. Whatever it is in terms of dry matter digestibility and feed intake. But it's not too late, I suppose, to manage it to maximize intake. And, you know, one of the things that we know that influences silage intake is chop length. So the shorter the silage is, the higher the intake will be. So for people who have a method of chopping silage, the finer you chop it, the more the sheep will eat of it. Okay, and that obviously increases their intake. And then feeding method as well. So how often do we feed it? You know, do we feed it every day? Do we feed it, you know, twice a week, 3 times a week, once a fortnight? Obviously, once the silage is open and exposed to the air, it starts to deteriorate. So the more frequently we feed it, the fresher, the higher quality it is. And I suppose the other thing as well is, I suppose, how often we remove the refusals. And refusals are basically, sheep are selective grazers, so they will pick out the leafy, more succulent leaves first and eat those, and they leave the stemmier, less palatable kind of stuff that is going off there, and they'll only eat that if they're forced to eat it. So the more frequently we remove the refusals, the higher the quality of what they're actually eating and digesting is. Okay, so there's a trade-off there between, okay, dumping some of the less leafy, more stemmy, less succulent type of stuff onto the dung heap, but getting better quality silage into the sheep. And part of that whole discussion as well is around access. And access is actually quite a significant issue on some farms. And here I have 2 pictures, and in both you can see a challenge with access, right? So I suppose here on the left-hand side, we've got a linear barrier. You see there's a lot of silage here in the middle. Obviously a bale that's been thrown in there, and it's being pronged or forked into the sheep. And what you can see here is the sheep have gone through it, and they've basically picked out the best of it. And what's left here is the refusals. Now we can force the sheep to eat that, and that'll maximize the amount of forage that we're eating, but it won't maximize their intake. Okay, so the silage that's out here, even though they can see it, they can't reach it. The same here with the round feeder. Okay, so you can see there's a round feeder here inside in the shed with some sheep standing around it. They still have access to it, but what you can see is happening is here, this kind of almost like a kebab type scenario. They can see it, but they can't reach it. Okay, so really important, I suppose, when we're trying to maximize the intake of the sheep on the forage side, is that they have access to it 24/7, right? And where this becomes a particular challenge is, I suppose, when we have hay, light hay on a linear system, because they keep nosing it out and out, and it starts pushing it into the passageway here where they can't reach it. you know, or where it also becomes an issue is, I suppose, if we have outdoors feeding ring feeders and we have an awful lot of mud and muck around here and they're standing up on this silage here and dirtying it, and we're forcing them to eat it. We're forcing them to dig through the muddy silage to eat because before we put in the next bale. So really important, I suppose, is with the outdoor systems, is that we keep it clean. And I suppose that's my kind of last area that I'm going to cover on this particular webinar is the whole area around hygiene. And we're very, very good at hygiene around lambing time. Look at most people are really good at lambing time. You're putting in lots of straw, cleaning out pens, bedding the sheep and all that. Great, great. But if the sheep have been inside in really dirty pens in the run up to lambing, you know, before, you know, 2-3 weeks out from lambing, they're on dirty slats that haven't been cleaned down or whatever, then the ewes are not going to be clean. And no matter how clean the lambing pen is going to be and how much effort we put into having everything clean at around lambing time, the ewes are filthy dirty. Underneath, their fleeces are full of dirt, and that's what the lambs are going to come in contact with. That's what we're coming in contact with when we're handling those sheep and assisting at the lambing time, and that's what the lambs are coming in contact with when they stand up and try to suckle. So really important, I suppose, is from a hygiene point of view that in the run-up to lambing, for those kind of 3 or 4 or 5 weeks before lambing, that we're good at bedding those pens, right? That we're putting in a little bit of extra straw, if it's a bedded shed, or if it's slats, that we're cleaning the slats regularly, going in and sweeping and cleaning them to keep them, to prevent that feces from building up and sticking to the ewes' fleeces. Water trucks, and Seamus mentioned water trucks, you know, with cattle, the big problem with water is them defecating into them, and the whole truck is full of feces. With sheep, I suppose it's more subtle. When we're bedding with straw, the sheep will be picking through the straw and then go and drinking water. When we're feeding silage, they'll do the same thing. They're eating a bit of silage and they say, "I want to drink water." Going, they've got bits of forage stuck in their mouth, ends up inside the water truck. The same with the meal. They're eating meal after meal. You'll see the ewes going to drink. There's meal, dust particles and stuff on their mouths, and that ends up inside in the water. And what happens over a period of time, and the audio will defecate into it or urinate into it, the water will become very stale and stagnant and dirty, and I suppose full of bacteria and gunk. So really important is that we check it daily, but that 2 times a week we empty it out. And the only way that I could ever do that from a practical point of view, would keep a few sheep myself, is that I pick 2 days in the week. Monday and a Thursday we clean out the trucks. Everybody knows Monday evening, Thursday evening, last job before we go in, we clean out the trucks, and then everything is clean. And look at, just check them then daily. In terms of concentrate feed, you know, managing the hygiene around that, keeping the vermin out. Okay, rats, mice, birds, you know, as well, I suppose, when we're feeding them as well, try and feed the meal in such a way that they eat it quickly and can get all of it eaten, that we don't have crows and pigeons coming in and rotivating the silage and defecating everywhere around the place. Silage, really important with the silage, is to remove the spoiled silage. Okay, so in an indoor system, that means, you know, I suppose cleaning out the trucks once or twice a week, getting rid of the old silage when you're replacing the new silage, removing the spoiled silage, leaving that silage build up. Basically what you end up doing is you have a whole heap of stuff there that is molding and rotting away. It probably has listeria active growing in it, and then you're putting the fresh silage on top of it. You're inoculating that with listeriosis and various other different bugs and baddies, you know, and that's not something that's positive. Same outdoors. Look at, really important that we move around. You know, if the silage is getting stood on and getting dirty, move on. Pick up the feeder, move it on, give them fresh stuff. You know, so that they're not coming in contact with that spoiled silage and the risk of listeria and things like that from it. So really important for the outdoor people, I suppose, is to move the trucks and the feeders regularly. And I know there's a good bit of work in that, but I suppose what you're trying to do is you're trying to keep the sheep clean. You're trying to keep the sheep clean, and you're trying to keep the feed clean, and that's what the whole kind of area of hygiene is all about. I suppose the other thing, just look at when we're bedding, is maybe put out a bit of lime as well in the house if you're bedding around the trucks. water troughs and along the feeding barrier, just to kind of disinfect that particular area before bedding. And that's very useful, I suppose, in terms of trying to reduce the spread of lameness in the house. So look, that's a real whistle-stop tour. I'm on my summary slide, Ciaran. So the key messages that I want people to take away from here is, for a lot of people, we're at the stage where you should be feeding sheep a little bit of meal, right? Definitely the triplets for the March lambing flocks, and probably the twins for a lot of people, unless you have very, very good quality silage. Really what we're about at this stage is avoiding excessive body condition score loss. We don't want the thin yos to lose more weight, right? And the benefit for that is that they're going to do a much better job on our lambs for us when they lamb down. Okay, so that's about looking after things like nutrition, parasites, lameness, and the nutrition is all of what we've talked about: keeping it clean, keeping access to it, maximizing your forage intake. I can't stress that enough. The amount of sheep that are looking at empty trucks, for hours every day, if you want to maximize the amount of forage that they're taking in, they have to have access to it all the time, and it has to be, they have to be able to reach it. And then look at the other message on the hygiene is, it's not just important at lambing time. It's important in the run up to lambing time. You want to have clean sheep at lambing time, and the only way you can do that is making sure that they don't get dirty prior to lambing. So there's no point in having them in dirty, poorly bedded pens in the run up to lambing, and then have really, super duper clean lambing pens and be wondering why you have lambs with joint ill and problems like that, because the reason why that's happened is because the yolks themselves are filthy, and the lambs are coming in contact with that before they get a chance to suckle and get the colostrum down the throat to give them that bit of protection. So I think that's me, Ciaran. So thank you, everybody, for your attention, and I'll try and stop sharing at this stage.
If you can, and see Seamus is back on.
Here we go.
Yeah, no, you're good. Thanks, Michael. Look, I think you did touch on something interesting and is relevant for most of us at the moment, particularly marsh lamb and flocks. That hygiene in that group area, layman in that group area, not a big investment, but kind of a big impact later on.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, there was a number of studies done a number of years ago, in the TET program at the time it was called, where they looked at basically liming in-house sheep pens along the troughs, around the water troughs and along the feed barrier, twice weekly before bedding. And basically what it did is it held the level of lameness at the kind of level of lameness that was there when the sheep were housed. Whereas in the untreated, the control groups where there was no treatment, the level of lame sheep in the house increased threefold, 3.5-fold actually. I think it went from 5 to 18%. So it's a very useful and cheapest chips tool. Bags of lime are relatively cheap. You're not going to use an awful lot of it. 4 or 5 bags of lime there will probably do most flocks, and it dries up the bed, keeps it cleaner, and it prevents the lameness from spreading. So it's a really useful thing. Yeah.
Look, I'm probably going to throw this one to both of you, but look, you mentioned about clean water and you're talking about maximizing forage intake. That's another factor, Michael, that's going to have an impact on it. And you did cover that. Like, it's something that can easily be overlooked. And like Seamus, I might throw to yourself just after that. Even from a disease point of view, it's a potential risk if you don't have a supply of clean water.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like dirty water, and the same Michael talked a good bit about the silage and that, listeriosis being a big risk, and if they're dropping bits of silage into the water, like that's the recipe for disaster for things like listeriosis, and then if they haven't access, like having good hydration and proper hydration, like going back to the triangle, that's also a big factor in keeping the immune system of the sheep right. So whatever she's coming in contact with, she has a far better chance of fighting it. So it's from both sides. You're decreasing the amount of bugs and also increasing the immunity of your sheep, or helping them.
Yeah, no, definitely. James, look, we were chatting a wee bit about clostridial vaccines a moment ago, and I suppose there are a couple of questions coming in around that. One of them, and it probably has happened every single one of us that's tried to do this, it's meant to be given subcutaneous. Invariably, now and again, it will go intramuscular. Does that have a big impact on it in terms of its efficacy, or can we still expect to get a good enough response?
Look, it's a very hard question to be definitive about, but you probably, look, if you know you've definitely gone intramuscularly, I would just go over the other side and give it under the skin. You know, two shots
Yeah.
is not, it's not, you're definitely not going to cause any problems by giving two shots. So if you're pretty happy you've gone into the muscle, why not just give it toward the other side under the skin and you're covering yourself.
Yeah, no, definitely. And look, when we're talking about just hygiene and that around it, obviously, look at automatic guns. There's a benefit to them insofar as you're not introducing any bacteria into that bottle. Well, probably it's easier because you can set them out. But even the needle you're using, you did mention that if it's not clean going in, given on wet days and that, you can get site abscesses if we're not taking care around that.
Yeah, not only, right, so you have the risk from getting an abscess, but if you get an abscess in there, then the vaccine won't work either. So you've causing a problem from an infection point of view in the sheep, and you're not getting the cover for your vaccine. So changing needles often enough is just something that, they're low cost, but people often overlook how vital they are to get the vaccine to work properly.
Yeah, just that extra couple of minutes maybe in changing that needle and spending a bit of time on it, yeah, definitely pays dividends. Look, I suppose we're talking about time, and most of our Clostridial vaccines, that booster window is kind of 8 weeks down to 2 weeks pre-lambing. Timing of that for most marsh lamb and flocks, given the fact that say if they start on the 1st of March, they could be going on for 6 weeks. You have to obviously 2 weeks is the minimum, but the kind of optimum time, Seamus, could go in a wee bit maybe too early in some cases, could you?
I would say I would always err on being early rather than late, Kieran. That's
Okay.
honestly, you know what I mean. I think if you talked about earlier about the animal being primed properly, as in it has two shots in earlier in life, and you're only given a booster, or if you're going with the two shots this time. But like if it's done properly, like the length of cover is a long time. So, I would definitely err on the side of going earlier rather than late. I don't think there's a problem. Like if you're only going to do them once and you have 6 week lambing period, like to me, it's more important that the first show is done 2 weeks before lambing than the last show. The last show will still be covered quite well.
No, I get you. And look, we'll always have them couple of ones come at the very start of it. Michael, just like look at obviously one of the key things for any of them vaccines to work is we've colostrum there and a feeding regime leading into it's important. I suppose probably two things are kicking in at the moment. You both touched on the kind of feeding rates, but introduce and concentrate to maybe those that are on crops or maybe coming in off grazing would really want to be getting that in now and get that transition started before they go into a house environment.
Yeah, I think we see quite a lot of problems, I suppose, in sheep in terms of trying to build it up too fast or too, not starting in time or transitioning as well, in particular from forage crops. This year gone by was a good year for forage crops, in a lot of places they went in early with a good back end. There was bumper yields there. There's a lot of sheep probably still out in forage crops. So um, uh, a kind of a gradual changeover is really important. And I suppose the challenge is that the closer you get to the D-Day of lambing, the bigger the risk is if you make a sudden change that you'll end up with Joes going down with, milk fever, twin lamb disease or things like that. So really important, I suppose, is that you do a gradual transition, so that's a bit of meal and maybe silage as well, or hay if that's what they're going on to when they go in, that they're introduced to that outside. In particular, if you're coming close, if you're 2 months out from lambing, it's not an issue. But I mean, if you're 4 weeks out from lambing, certainly would be an issue. Switching from forage crops to a totally different diet based on concentrates and silage or hay. So in that situation, I'd be saying be very careful and make sure that, a few weeks out from your housing that you've introduced the housing diet at least partially to them so that they have access to long forage outside and in particular concentrates. So that would be very important. Yeah.
Okay. Look, you touched on feed management and even Seamus mentioned there about feed space. I suppose two things that crop up in the questions here. One is, access to silage ad lib. That's not a risk for prolapse, but it is a necessity to get that intake, as you touched on. The importance of feed space, Michael, at that point, and maybe just dealing with shy feeders. Is that a risk for prolapse or other health issues, do you think?
Yeah, invariably, I think in most sheds we walk into, Kieran, we don't have enough trough space. And generally, truck space is identified by can we fit the sheep in there, and really enough trough space is not, can the sheep fit in there? It's they should have more than that, because what happens when you start feeding sheep is, you run along with your bucket or your bag, and after 30 seconds there's a ewe at the bottom, that isn't happy with what she has in front of her, and she changes her mind, backs out and comes up along and wants to fit in somewhere along there. So really that's where the type of 500 mils or 600 mils of truck space is what most people are playing with lowland sheep, that Seamus had in his table there, that we should be doing. And that's about basically taking out a measuring tape and measuring it. And I would say that 9 out of 10 yards that we walk into the sheep, they don't have enough space, and they become under pressure then when they get heavy and get bigger. And at that challenge, that's the high risk time for prolapsing, and as well as that, I suppose, for those shy feeders to be bullied out and not get their share, and they're then the sheep that become at risk of getting things like twin lamb disease, and having small undersized lambs, maybe not enough colostrum and all that type of thing, because they simply can't get to the feed. So it's relatively cheap to fix that problem, even in a linear system. It's just you just need to get an extra truck and throw it into the pen with them, if that's if you're short.
Yeah. And look, I think that ties in, Seamus, with what you were talking about as well. It's that holistic approach. It's the individual, if it gets compromised in any way, is more susceptible to everything. Seamus, you touched on abortions at the start, and I suppose enzootic for years has been one of the number one cause of abortion. I suppose in the next couple of weeks, the biosecurity risk, Seamus, of bringing in a foster ewes or pet lambs, and the risk of that transmitting Enzo into what was otherwise a clean flock. Because even going by your figures, there's a lot of them flocks that have showed up with it that weren't vaccinating. It's important we keep an eye on what animals we bring in during that lambing period. So foster ewes and pet lambs, are they a risk?
Yeah, the simple answer is definitely, Kieran, and what can seem a short-term gain can be huge long-term negative, and any time you bring any sheep onto your farm, it should go through proper procedures. That's quarantine, whatever, depending on its age, or for worms, etc., vaccination. So so if you turn around and suddenly decide you need a foster, like you need her today, so you can't go through all the proper quarantine and etc. So she is a huge biosecurity risk then, and the fact that she's available to me is always a little red flag to some degree, even.
Yeah, no, true. Look, when we're talking about biosecurity, I suppose, and you mentioned a lot of different infectious agents that can cause abortion. There's a wee bit of personal hygiene and taking care of those that are in that lambing shed as well, particularly using gloves and that. There is a risk with some of those conditions that humans themselves can pick up. They're zoonotic, some of them.
Yeah, especially, I suppose, pregnant women are very much, a lot of these are high risk, for them. But even for ourselves, for everyone, it's always human health. We're all one animal, one welfare. You know what I mean? It's all tied in, and so yeah, using the proper precautions, as you said, gloves, things like that, having water, soap available. The same, when you're going back into your house, that you take off, you proper wash, facilities to wash. That's why having proper facilities on the farm, in the shed, lambing shed, etc., for washing, gloves, etc., is hugely important. Because it's not only yourself, it's your family you're trying to protect as well.
Seamus, it'd be remiss of me when I have you on not to ask you, and it's something we hopefully don't meet on farms, but where you do encounter health problems, particularly abortion problems, the need to get in early maybe and get a diagnosis on that is important. What do you need in the lab to get a good diagnosis on potential issues?
So to me, the placenta in sheep, like if you look at the two pictures of the two main abortion agents I showed, I didn't show a lamb, I showed the placenta in both cases. So the placenta to me is probably the most important, if possible. But look, that's not always available to someone. And then the other thing is, the more you can submit, the better. Like, if you have a few abortions, if you can bring them all, I know especially if they've happened close together, um, because everybody loses a few lambs or has a few thrown lambs, but you can be lucky or unlucky when you bring the one. Is that the one that's has the problem, or it just happens to be one of those ones without it? So the more material you can bring, the placenta and the lambs bring both, the better, more likely you're to get a diagnosis. There is available things, you know, like blood testing as well to try and check for some of these agents.
Well, someone that works, James, could be planning a little bit for next year as well to put a vaccination program in place. Like it's very worth doing. I know it's a busy time of the year, but it's one of them essential things we should consider.
Yeah, well, as I said, like especially EAE, like you know, we've all known cases of that where the warning flags were there one year, but they were just ignored. You know, we've only had a few. Let's, you know, basically, and the following year has been a disaster for some of these farmers, and so that's why getting, you know, and I do think if you in the next couple of weeks off and we're not that busy, you know, it's very, very hard. Look, you know, when lambing has actually started, like, you know, people just, it's very, very hard to do anything at that stage. But often people have that bit more time now before lambing actually starts. So I think it's, you know, if they have abortions, they probably, you know, I think it was a sheep farmer said to me, never waste a dead animal.
Yeah. No, I think it's a fair point. So it is. Look, I'm conscious we're approaching hour. Michael, I might just throw you one final one. Look, you both talked about those thinner ewes. Probably one aspect of that is checking why they're thin, but in terms of that intervention and feeding them, probably some are a little bit risky. Do you feed that single, will you end up too big of lambs? But it's essential that we actually deal with those early as opposed to waiting until the very end.
Yeah, so look at it. I mean, ideally, ideally thin ewes need to be pulled out at weaning time. Check why they're thin, you know. So is there any kind of underlying issues, the things that Seamus talked about there, bad mouths and things like that. You know, given a chance to recuperate if they're sound, and then, you know, hopefully at mating time they're not thin, and then we don't have the whole problem. You know, and that's the ideal scenario, and we're seeing that on some of the better farms when we're going around their body condition scoring at the moment. You know, there's very low numbers of thin ewes on some of the farms where people have really paid attention to that and made sure that the sheep had grow ball through mating and after it. I suppose the challenge is where you have thin ewes, and it's not about trying to fatten the thin ewes at this stage, because that's not going to work. You know, so the person who identifies that they have a lot of thin ewes now at scanning time, you know, it's not about feeding the bejesus out of them and hoping that we're going to put weight on them. That's not going to happen. You're just going to swell the lambs, right? But what we don't want is for them to lose more weight. And that's where I'm talking about. So generally, most ewes will lose weight between scanning and lambing time. That's a natural phenomenon. So if you follow the kind of feeding guidelines, the feeding guidelines generally are for ewes to lose a little bit of weight. So if there's a thin ewe there, she has no weight to lose. You know, we really cannot afford to lose weight. So what we're trying to do there is feed them to maintain their weight. And that's why we're saying put the thin single ewes in with the twins, put the thin twins in with the triplets, because what we're trying to do is to prevent them ewes from getting thinner, because we know that if they get thinner, there's a much higher likelihood that they will lose their lamb at some stage, in particular if we get a bad spring. So 2022, 2023 and 2024, we got really bad springs, and farmers with thin ewes had big losses of lambs after turnout. 2025, the year gone by, was a real good spring, and people got away with it. You know, the thin flocks got away with it because everything was good, lots of grass, the weather was kind, everything worked out. You know, but we don't know what the spring is going to be like. So really, we need to try and maintain, you know, or reduce as best we can those thin ewes from losing weight.
Very good. Gentlemen, thank you very much for that tonight. We're going across the hour, and I'm sure I could keep us going for another half hour. Certainly good level of interest in the questions. Two very useful talks, Seamus. Really appreciate you coming on with us. Michael, appreciate you coming back with us. We will have a recording of this webinar available on the Teagasc Sheep YouTube channel in the coming weeks. So I'd just like to thank both of you for giving up your time to come on with us. I'd like to thank our participants for tuning in. We will be back with you on the 11th of February, and we're going to cover some practical tips in the lead into lambing. But for that, we're going to leave it to it for tonight. And I'd like to thank everybody again for tuning in.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone.
Good night.